Every revolution starts in the minds of the people. Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today is Wednesday, March 11th, coming to you from rainy Western New York, and been talking a lot about the Iran war and some of the nitty-gritty details. How's it going? What is the administration saying, etc. And I want to pull back a little bit and talk in a more general sense about the general discontent with the establishment, the elites, whatever you want to call it, definitely with the government. And a lot of people, of course, who voted for Donald Trump are very disappointed in the fact that he campaigned so hard on not, quote unquote, regime change wars, getting us into regime change wars thousands of miles away, not getting into forever wars. And I mentioned on the podcast yesterday that he actually used the words forever war as a possibility for Iran. I think trying to make the point that the U.S. was not going to run out of missiles or be able to sustain the war if Iran did. But in any case, just the irony that he would use those words after campaigning directly against them. No more forever wars. And, you know, it's not just Trump, but it's been quite a long time where, let's just say, President Obama, who campaigned sounding not quite as socialist as a lot of people claim that he did, but certainly as a left of center Democrat, and talked a lot about income inequality, all of the things that socialists like to hear. And then when he proposed his Obamacare, it turned out to be a big disappointment to the far left of his supporters because it seemed like it was just a handout to big corporations, which of course it was. And what it was designed to be, even when they were fiddling around with it, implemented it in Massachusetts, basically the same plan. Back when they were debating basically the same plan in the 1990s, Hillary Care was going to mandate employers instead of individuals. And then the Republican answer to that, you know, being as big government a party as the Democrats, was, well, no, we'll just mandate individuals. That all was a Republican idea, which of course, you know, goes against the way Republicans, who used to campaign as libertarians back then, and then when they got into office would rule like social democrats. And that includes Mr. Reagan, by the way. And I wanted to give you all a way of looking at these things, a different perspective for looking at these things that makes a lot more sense than just either one, that the people we elect are incompetent. A lot of times they are, and hypocritical, and to give you a different lens through which to evaluate, you know, what elected people do, what the government itself does, including the vast unelected bureaucracy that really runs the world at this point, along with their partners in the private sector who get protection, get privileges, get handouts, get bailouts, etc. And to a lot of people, none of this makes sense, either on the right or the left. And I say that with the context that libertarians are neither on the right or the left. And I've talked a lot about that before, but you can read my book, Where Do Conservatives and Liberals Come From, to get an explanation of why I think that's true and why I think if you read that book, you would agree that's true. But why they're always perplexed, why they elect these people that run on one thing and then they kind of always get the same result, and it's not what they voted for. And there's a great book that I think I've mentioned from time to time that I'm going to try to summarize without taking half the day here, enough to give you a way of thinking about these things, about what our elected officials and bureaucracy do rather than what they say, and also why they say what they say and why they don't mean what they say, why they actually are logical if you look at it through this lens. So the book I'm talking about is by an author called Franz Oppenheimer, and it's called The State and Its History and Development Viewed Sociologically. A lot of people just shorten it to The State. And Oppenheimer wasn't exactly a libertarian, and he had a bigger role for government than most modern libertarians would have, arguably that the Jefferson wing of the founders of the United States would have, certainly not the Hamiltonian wing. And basically what he set out to do was to explain the state and how it came about. Now, everyone knows I'm a big John Locke fan, and this book hasn't changed that. But you'll remember that, in previous discussions about the Lockean theory of the society and government, that, Locke proposed that the way a just society would come about and a just political system. So Locke was talking about what should be, okay? And he said something to the effect of, when a group of people have a mind to combine for the mutual protection of their lives, liberties, and possessions or estates, which I will call by the general name of property, that this is the reason they put themselves under the power of a government. And then he makes the statement that the chief end of political societies and government is preservation of their property. And he's able to say that because he's defined property as life, liberty, and your justly acquired possessions. And that's the way it should be. And what Oppenheimer has done is saying, I want to know how states really came to be. And he provides a lot of evidence for his theory. But before he gets into, he has a 6-stage process, and I'll summarize that briefly. But he first has a subsection at the beginning of his treatise called The Political and Economic Means. And I'll read this to you verbatim because it's not that long. It says, there are two fundamentally opposed means whereby man, requiring sustenance, is impelled to obtain the necessary means for satisfying his desires. These are work and robbery, one's own labor, and the forcible appropriation of the labor of others. And then it says, robbery, exclamation point, forcible appropriation. These words convey to us ideas of crime and the penitentiary, since we are the contemporaries of a developed civilization, specifically based on the inviolability of property. So you could see that at the time Oppenheimer was writing, around the turn of the 20th century, that this idea of property being central to civilization is still foremost. I mean, nobody talks that way anymore. And that's the chief problem with our political system, is nobody thinks in terms of disputes should be settled on the basis of who has a property right or whose has been violated. So he goes on to say, and this tang is not lost when we are convinced that land and sea robbery is the primitive relation of life, just as the warrior's trade, which also for a long time is only organized mass robbery, constitutes the most respected of occupations. And he's saying really the military life is rooted in the plunderer, the robber, the armed robber, both because, and I'm back to Oppenheimer now, Both because of this and also on account of the need of having in the further development of this study terse, clear, sharply opposing terms for these very important contrasts, I propose the following discussion to call one's own labor and the equivalent exchange of one's own labor for the labor of others the economic means. So anything you obtain by your own work or by peaceful trade with somebody else, nobody's forced, those are the economic means for getting what you need and want. And then back to Oppenheimer, while the unrequited appropriation of the labor of others will be called the political means. So the political means is just defined as robbery. Okay. And I know this smacks of the modern libertarian, saying taxation is theft. And of course, that is in the same spirit here. But he's going to put together kind of a historical, and he provides, reams of examples of the stages that he says that arises, from which the state arises. And he says the first stage in the development of a modern state is the robbery and killing stage. And he just says that in primitive societies where agriculture was new, you had certain types of people in very fertile land who discovered that they could lead a sedentary life, and that if they grew plants instead of hunting and gathering and herded animals, raised animals, that they could have a higher standard of living, of course. And from this comes leisure time. And from this comes all art and science and all the things we think of civilization. Most anthropologists agree that, the development of agriculture was the key stage in developing civilization among human beings and getting us out of the hunter-gatherer stage where you're spending basically all your waking hours trying to find food or resting up so you could try to find food. And he points to a particular pattern in history where these sedentary populations grew up in the fertile lands that were bordered by deserts or plains, where you had the more nomadic groups, and he calls them the herdsmen, who didn't live in one place. They basically just herded animals. And the birth of the military lifestyle is in the herding nomadic community. And there's lots of details here that I encourage you to read the book, and I'll post a link to it on the show notes page. Please use my link because I'll get a little commission from that. In fact, if you use a link to anything on Amazon from my website, not only you don't have to buy the thing that was the link was to, but anything during that Amazon session that you buy, I get a little commission. So that's a way you could support the show. Another way you could support the show is, of course, to like, comment, and subscribe to this podcast. Please leave comments on the show notes page or in the comments section of the YouTube version of this podcast, rather than sending me emails, because most importantly, the rest of the world gets the benefit of your great insights. And of course, it helps the page get higher in rankings. More new people see it, and we want to grow our little community here. So, commercial over. Please do those things and get on my email list. I'll talk more about that at the end. But so you have the situation where there's always a population of nomadic herdsmen just outside the fertile areas where people are starting to lead these sedentary lives. And the herdsmen soon discover that these people are ripe for the plucking to just raid and pillage and plunder. And this is actually the first stage in the development of the state. You have the plunderers who live out in the plains, and their lifestyle actually, in many ways, contributes to them adopting the political means, the plundering. First of all, he talks about how they get a lot more protein. They tend to be stronger because they're eating meat and they're always on the move. They generally are carrying all their possessions with them as they move. So there's no need for long supply lines or anything like that. I don't want to get into every detail and get distracted, but there are a lot of advantages as far as if you want to be a plunderer for the herdsman nomadic life. And there's a lot of disadvantages to resisting them when you're in the sedentary farming life, because you're not learning the military tactics. It's even the movement from place to place. And all, the herdsman lifestyle contributes to the development of warriors and a warrior class. And the warrior class did not come out of saving damsels in distress. It came out of armed robbery. That is its roots. And this is, of course, Oppenheimer's thesis, and you can agree or disagree with it, but he provides a lot of proof, and I recommend you read the book before you dismiss it. So he also talks about the two types of primitive states, and one is the feudal state, and the other one which grows out of the herdsmen invading the farmers. And the other one is the maritime state. And this would be more like the Vikings, just coming and plundering, murdering, stealing, and carrying off everything they could, goods, women, whatever. And then they leave and they consume their plunder, and then they do it again. And that's the first stage in the development of the state. But the second stage is when the plundering class, the warriors, whether they're maritime or feudal, or herdsmen, discover that, it would be a lot better, if we keep plundering the same people. Pretty soon, they either die off or run off, or, they're not producing enough to allow us to just keep stealing everything they've got. And so he calls the second stage the beekeeper stage, where the plunderers figure out that it's advantageous to them to leave enough honey so that the bees can make it through the winter. And to expand on that farther, that leave them enough of their own stuff so that they can produce more and we can raid them again. And, this is economically, through the political means, more efficient, right? Because you're not killing the host, so to speak. And then he talks about the third stage, which is the tribute stage, where the herdsmen or the maritime plunderers decide that it's kind of like the beekeeper stage, but instead of just coming in and robbing everything, they're going to exact tribute. And we don't need to come in and kill anybody. We don't even need to hit anyone over the head, as long as you agree that you give us X amount of your stuff, of your produce. And we still don't have really a government here, because it's really just give us your stuff and we won't kill you or rob it. We won't, he'll just give it to us. Now, of course, this is not voluntary. The people giving up the tribute are only doing it so that they don't get speared, right? But again, it's less dangerous for the plunderers. I mean, some of the plunderers get killed when the peasants try to defend themselves. So if we can get them to just give it up and not have to go and kill them, then that's even better for us. And it reminds me of, if you were a fan of The Walking Dead, either the comic book series or graphic novel. I guess when you're an adult, you call them graphic novels. I used to read them. I loved them. But where the saviors, they kill two of the Alexandrians, and then they say, we're not going to kill the rest of you. We're just going to take half your stuff. So every month, or I can't remember how often it was, the saviors would show up. And the first time they show up, you remember that Negan has got his baseball bat with the barbed wire, and he's banging on the gate. We're here to collect. All right, so that's the tribute stage. Now, the fourth stage is where we're starting to see the emergence of a political society, And it's important to mention, and I didn't mention this before, that the herdsmen or the maritime raiders are foreigners. I mean, we don't have countries at this point, but we do have, the people who live in the fertile area and these other people who may be ethnically different or maybe not, but they're definitely a different tribe. They don't consider themselves the same community. But in the fourth stage, a union forms between the plunderers and the plundered. And there could be a lot of reasons for this. One of them chiefly would be that there's another group now that wants to plunder the peasants. Okay. So there's a third group. You had the plundered and the plunderers, and now we have a group, plunderers too, completely different group. And of course, the first group of plunderers doesn't want somebody else horning in on their action. Think about the mafia. I will protect you. You pay me tribute, and I will protect you from these other guys. The Corleones will protect you from the Bazzinis, right? Or the Italias. So there, over time, becomes a union where the plunderers and the plundered begin to think of themselves as the same community. And it's the warrior class, the robber class's job to protect the peasants from this external group. And this is the beginning of when they start to think of themselves all as one society with two classes. And the two classes are not the rich and the poor. The two classes are the plunderers and the plundered. Okay? And the nobility, what we'll later call the nobility, is really just the descendants of this plunderer robber class. So what happens in the fifth stage? The fifth stage is when the plunderer class begins to realize that, the peasants, as they've been allowed to become a little more wealthy, have disputes among themselves, and it behooves the plunderers to settle those disputes. You don't want your producers fighting with each other and producing less. So the idea that it's also the robber's job to not only protect the peasants from external enemies, but also to settle disputes between the plundered class. Okay? And the idea of courts arises. So you could see how, again, if you read Oppenheimer's book, he provides evidence for all these. This isn't just a theory. It is a theory, but it's backed up by a lot of evidence. And I'm thinking, when I got to this point in the book, what I was thinking of was Ian's History of England and his account of the Normans conquering England. And, the first thing they did was, exact tribute. So they're farther along on this. This is one state invading another, so it's farther along on this development. But, all the elements are still there. And then you had, at that time, the organic Anglo-Saxon courts and the feudal lords. And after a while, the king realized that, the feudal lords would be a problem, even his fellow Norman feudal lords, and that he established the king's courts, where if a peasant, a serf, didn't think he was being treated fairly by the lord, could go to the king's court, and almost like an appellate court. Okay? But this is all just to make the king just making sure that he gets what he's supposed to out of the feudal lords who get it from the peasants. So these things just ran through my mind as I was reading the book. And the sixth stage is really like the full-on state. And I'm going to read this part verbatim because it's a little murkier, the difference between the fifth and the sixth states, because you would think that once, the warrior class was charged with not only defending the serfs from external enemies, but also settling disputes amongst the serfs, that at that point you have a government. But let me read what Oppenheimer says about the sixth stage. So he says the necessity of keeping the subjects in order and at the same time of maintaining them at their full capacity for labor leads step by step from the fifth to the sixth stage, in which the state, by acquiring full intra-nationality and by the evolution of nationality in quotes, and he capitalizes it, is developed in every sense. The need becomes more and more frequent to interfere, to allay difficulties, to punish, or to coerce obedience, and thus develop the habit of rule and the usages of government. The two groups, separated to begin with, and then united on one territory, are at first merely laid alongside one another, then are scattered through one another like a mechanical mixture, as the term is used in chemistry, until gradually they become more and more of a chemical combination. They intermingle, unite, amalgate to unity in customs and habits and speech and worship. Soon the bonds of relationship unite the upper and the lower strata. In nearly all cases, the master class picks the handsomest virgins from the subject races for its concubines. A race of bastards thus develops, sometimes taken into the ruling class, sometimes rejected, and then because of the blood of the masters in their veins, become the born leaders of the subject race. In form and in content, the primitive state is completed. So he's saying that's the way that states actually through history have come about. And again, he provides all these examples. And he goes on from the primitive state to the development of the feudal state, the development of the constitutional state, and the tendency of the development of the state. There's more to it, but that's kind of enough for our purposes today for you to look at the elites and the people who are in government. And you'll notice that, when people take a look at the democratically elected government, that it turns out that a ridiculously high percentage of these people are somewhat related. And that's a whole rabbit hole we could go down another day. But there's definitely a class of people. Now, we talk about the poor, the working class, the middle class, the upper class, the elites, the 1%. And you can use economic measurements to separate those. But I would suggest to you that just as when Oppenheimer wrote this, and just as at the beginning of historical civilization, that there's two classes. There's the class that uses the political means to obtain their wants and desire, their needs and wants, and the economic class, the one who produces everything for the political class to plunder. And you don't have to be an elected official or be in the government to be using the political means. So let me use 3 examples. I'll use war, taxation in general, and regulation. So, of course, Oppenheimer is focusing, especially in the parts of the book that I summarized for you, purely on taxation. It's just, we're going to collect a certain amount of money from you, and we're just going to, keep it for ourselves. It's a much more honest form of the political means than the one we have today, where they have to convince you that this is all for some mythical common good, which doesn't exist. And that's the origin of taxation. It starts with plunder, and over time, it becomes a custom, but it's still taken by force, just as it is today. And again, it's put through this filter of sales talk that this is all for some common good. But in reality, all of this, all taxed money flows into the state, and almost all of it is for the benefit of some private individuals who may at that point be working for the government or not, or be shareholders in a corporation, or whatever for their own personal benefit. Okay. And I know this kind of rhymes with public choice theory, but it's not exactly the same as that. And maybe we'll talk about that on a different podcast. But I would suggest to you, when you look at what is taxed from, we'll just stick with the United States. And I think I did something on this in an earlier podcast, and I can't remember what year it was. It could have been 2023, because that was the most recent year we had all the numbers in. But when you take all of the taxation, and I'm talking all the sales taxes, all the income taxes, all of the user fees, those fees on your hotel bill, the fees on your cell phone bill, everything, put it all together, it came to like $11 trillion. Okay. And out of that 11 trillion, 6 trillion were direct transfer payments. Okay. So they were taken from one person and just paid to another. They didn't build a bridge. They didn't build a road. They didn't pay police officers. They didn't, all the things that they tell you your taxes are going to make it sound legitimate, like protecting your life and property. No, 6 trillion of that 11 trillion was just taken from you and given to somebody else. And those people weren't necessarily poor, by the way. You know, it's the first thing you do when, or someone says when you start talking transfer payments, you must hate the poor. Well, I got news for you. A small percentage of that went to the poor, who are not like the monolithic group. You know, the people in the lowest income ranges, most of them don't stay there, but that's, again, a subject for another day. So more than half of it was a direct transfer payment. And then when you put in public schooling and things like the healthcare programs like Medicare and Medicaid, then it gets up to like 80%. Like almost all the money is just taken, you know, from one person and paid out to another. Now, not all of it goes to like Genghis Khan, the ruling class, for their personal luxury, but some of it does. But it certainly is not necessary to maintain civilization, law and order, etc., roads and bridges, even though that should be privatized as well. And at one time was in the United States. Almost none of what's your tax goes for that. It's almost all to buy something for somebody else or just to cut them a check. Okay, a big part is just to cut them a check. So, okay. So taxation is one way whereby people can obtain what they need through the political means. Regulation is the other chief way that they can do that. And again, you know, just like taxation is sold as like, oh, you can't have civilization without it. You know, I guess I won't see you driving on the roads if you object to taxation, where it's like the roads are not even a rounding error in the amount of money the government spends. But anyway, regulation is sold similarly, that it's either going to make life safer or fairer, one of the two, some lofty thing. But what regulation really does, and really there is no disputing this, it limits competition. So without regulation, people could sell anything they want and they could buy anything they want. And people say, oh my God, you'll get tainted meat and polluted medications and da-da-da, right? But there really is there's no right of one person to prevent somebody else from either buying or selling something that they think is unsafe. Okay. And no individual has this right. They certainly can't delegate it to a government. All right. So how did regulation really come about? And I'm going to take less time on this because I've done work on this before. The progressive era really came about where the richest of the robber barons competing with each other didn't, wanted less competition. And I always use the meat packing thing because it's such a great example where, the big meat packing companies had this huge trust, and they did in fact do what the progressive myth says that they try to do, which is we're going to, corner the market and raise our prices and charge, it wouldn't be technically monopoly prices unless there was only one company, but they often call it monopoly prices. But every time they tried to do that, millions of independent farmers would say, I got beef and I could sell it a lot cheaper than that. And they would flood the market. And these companies, when we're on the verge of bankruptcy, whenever they tried to charge above the market price, that's what actually happened. And then they passed the bill in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act, I believe. I'm going on memory here. And that made it illegal for most of those small competitors. Now, the small competitors weren't selling tainted meat. The meat was fine. Nobody was dropping dead from food poisoning or even getting sick. Okay. I'm sure there were newspaper articles where they found one batch of tainted meats and, oh my God, look at this. We need regulation. And of course, that's how it's sold, right? It's sold to the public that we need this because you're in great danger. Okay. Think of how the wars are sold. Think about how climate change is sold. But at the end of the day, what's the result of all this? Let's forget what the intentions are. The result is you have far less products at your disposal, and the people who lobbied for the regulation now are the only ones you're allowed to buy from. And their products are a lot more expensive. And if it weren't for the regulation, you'd be able to buy something just as good, just as useful to you, a lot cheaper. And that's really what it's all about. It's a racket. It always has been. The very first regulations, that's what they were. Okay. And they're sold with this. And now people have a false history that they think that they really should be called robber barons, but not for the reason that people say. The progressives sell the myth that the robber barons, through the free market, were able to become so big and destroy all their competitors and raise prices, and we needed regulation to protect the consumers from that. But that's not what happened. That never happened. Never. The opposite happened. The free market was protecting the consumers from the robber barons, trying to do that. And the robber barons then lobbied the government for decades, actually, for regulation to get rid of those competitors so they could charge the higher prices. And in every case where an unregulated industry became regulated, the prices were higher, much higher than they were before. And that includes, like when they broke up Standard Oil, it was the same thing. Okay. So it's a racket. Taxation is a racket. It's sold with, the idea that it's going to make the public safer. And often, by instituting a false panic, like the one that rose up about the meat, that all the meat was tainted and it needed to be regulated, when that was never true. And I should say that along with the people who are benefiting most from this, who lobby, who make all this possible, you do have hordes of true believers, useful idiots, if you will. And that's why I always say the socialists and the progressive movement are the useful idiots. They're the ones who really believe that the regulation is needed and that the free market doesn't work and that this is going to make things better or fairer. And all it does is make the richest richer. And I don't mind them getting rich in free and open competition to get as rich as you want. But the richest of the rich are as rich as they are, and the disparities are what they are because on top of any talent that they have and on top of what they are able to accumulate fairly by having great products or great innovations, they have the second layer of wealth that they extract from the public through the political means. So this is kind of the modern, especially in the United States, which is ostensibly capitalist, but I mean, it's got this huge layer of regulation on top of a somewhat market economy. And all that does is protect the biggest companies from competition from smaller ones. And it does stifle innovation. Now, there's still great innovation happening, but you're not going to see the Wright brothers again, inventing the airplane out of their bicycle shop in a situation where, you're not allowed to do that, that you have to follow all these regulations. And being a small business owner myself with a brick and mortar business, I mean, in New York, it's the epitome of this. And on top of like the very high minimum wages, you have like the Family Medical Leave Act. Like employers pay that in New York State. Where do you think the money comes from? So even though, none of your employees might ever use it, you're paying a percentage of all the wages you pay into this fund so that they can then pay people to take 6 months off when they have a baby or whatever. So, and then of course that goes into the price. I mean, like any other business owner, I have to take my cost of doing business, all right, so that my labor costs are artificially inflated. And then the multiplier on top, in some states, it's only 1.075 because all they have to do is take out their half of the FICA money that they pay. The employee pays the other 7.5%. But in New York, it's more like 1.1 because you've got Family Medical Leave Act, you've got this huge workers' comp benefit that's extremely generous, and disability, and all these different things that you have to pay. And all these regulations you have to follow that make the cost of business higher. And so that fixed cost just to be operating is one cost. Then you have your cost of goods sold, right? So in any case, and in a lot of cases, your cost of goods sold is higher because those people are complying with all these regulations. So it eventually just drives up the price for the consumer. So that's why prices are so much higher. And even in Western New York here, we're not in New York City, than maybe in my previous, where I lived in Tampa before that. And not that Florida isn't also terrible on this, but they're not nearly as bad as New York. So in every single case where you can't understand why politicians do what they do, think about it in these terms. So they may not be taxing the money and like putting it right in their own bank account, but they're put into office by people who want to use the political means. They want some advantageous regulation that gives them a leg up on their competitors. They love to eliminate competition. So what's the whole climate change thing about? You're not going to be allowed to drive gasoline-powered cars. You're only going to be able to buy these more expensive electric cars. And why? To save the planet. All right, so this is the pattern, right? We give you this crisis, and it's so over the top. And when you get to be my age, when you've heard it for like 40 years, next year, there's 10 more years, that's it. And at this point in my life, 170 years into the industrial age, which just happens to coincide with the end of the Little Ice Age, we're up 1 degree. Okay. So if the climate alarmists are correct, then the only safe temperature for humanity would be the temperatures we had during the Little Ice Age. Now, I know that's argued that was more regional than global, but certainly had an effect on global temperatures, whether, that was just a regional phenomenon. So they're saying that nothing, even 1 degree higher than the Little Ice Age is unsafe for humanity, which of course is ridiculous, right? The humanity was born at the equator in Africa, supposedly in Africa. I know people are disputing that now, but we'll go with the conventional theory right now, under much warmer conditions. So take that for what it is. And again, I mean, you can go from one thing to another. Everything, every argument you hear in the political sphere, notice one thing. It's always about more money and less freedom for you. It's always, you've got to pay more. You've got to sacrifice. Barack Obama shared sacrifice. Now the Trump administration's saying the same thing. Because of this Iran war, you're going to have to pay higher prices for a while. But in the long term, it'll be better. Short-term pain, long-term gain. That somebody did a montage. Maybe I'll link to it on the show notes page. It's another one of these things where obviously the talking point went out and every surrogate on every channel is saying the same exact words. Like, so you know it's a scam. That's the sales talk. All right. It's the sales talk to sell you the Iran war. All right. And the last thing I'll talk about, war has traditionally been the chief avenue for the political means. And you could say, well, what about, a defensive war? There rarely is a purely defensive war. I'd say the American Revolution is the only one in the United States history, which was purely defensive. But yes, the military, if you believe that any kind of a state is required at all, you need some kind of a military. And I would say even in an anarcho-capitalist society, you would need some kind of military establishment, even if it was private, to be able to defend you from, plunderers too, right? So, but if you look at the numbers on even like, let's say the war on terror. So 25 years ago, when George W. Bush started the war on terror, he increased military spending dramatically even before 9/11. That was already on the table. And contrary, the Congress has the purse strings, kind of, but the president writes up what he wants and then he sends it to Congress and they rubber stamp it. That's how it really works. And if you're a Congress member who dissents and says, no, we're spending too much, see Thomas Massey, okay? Play ball and let the president dictate what we spend, or that's what happens to you. So anyway, Bush increased the military spending to something like 300 billion. I know that sounds quaint now, but and then after 9/11, the war on terror began and started with Afghanistan. And then it eventually, he started the war in Iraq, which completely unjustifiable. I mean, Afghanistan was unjustifiable, but it was a little more plausible that Osama bin Laden was supposedly in the country. And I think he was. I think if you read your Scott Horton, then at one point he was actually there. They eventually found him in Pakistan. But if you believe that story. But I remember that 5 years into the war on terror, there was this big headline, we've spent 400 billion on the war on terror. Well, but I thought we were spending 300 billion per year on military spending. Well, it turns out that the wars don't really cost all that much. I mean, it's money that the government doesn't have, so, it's too much. But it was something like after 5 years, it was 400 billion. In other words, it was only costing about 80 billion a year for the war out of the 320 billion in military spending. And this has been the case all along. So when the Afghanistan war ended in late 2021, when Joe Biden led the troops out in spectacular fashion there, I took a look to see, okay, and this is before the Ukraine war started, is military spending going to go down? We just stopped a war. No, it went up. So the vast majority of military spending is not even devoted to fighting a war. It's just to maintain this huge monolith of warehousing troops all over the world, 200,000 of them overseas, and then all the ones that are, housed here. And, it's mostly a ripoff. And also to pay all of these defense contractors for stuff that doesn't work, for fighter jets that take decades to finish and still malfunctioning all over the place. I mean, that's all just money that is sucked out of your pocket and blown. Okay, but people benefit from it. They benefit by using the political means. And a huge part of the military. Now, there was a time, again, in the United States, we had this brief period where, a much less larcenous government existed. And it used to be that, yes, military is always the biggest part of the government, but it was much smaller. The whole government was only spending 3% of GDP. Today it spends 30%. Well, I mean, if you take it all, state, local, federal, I would argue that since it's only 27 billion is the total and 6 billion are transfer payments, you should really subtract that out because all that comes from the 27 billion. So it's like 11 billion out of 21 billion, something like that. It's like spending half of everything that's produced. But in any case, I think the federal government is up near 30%, and then you got the states and the local governments spending a lower amount, but on top of that. So, the vast majority of the military budget is just a ripoff. So it used to be the point I was getting to is that when there was a war, spending would go way up. We're going to spend a lot more money. We're fighting a war. That's not really the case anymore. You look at military spending in war years and what we call peacetime years, and it's not that different because most of the money is just maintaining the empire, this vast, bloated, larcenous structure called the military. I mean, when you have social programs going on we want the women to go into combat, we want trans people to be admirals or whatever. I mean, that's where you know that you don't need any of this. Your safety is not dependent. They're just throwing money around. So anyway, that's a way to look at this. So think about what Trump has said about both funding the Gaza thing for Israel and the Iran war. Talked about we're going to blow the whole place up to smithereens, and then we're going to rebuild it. Remember when Gaza was going to be like a Trump, resort or something? When that idea was floating through his head. Well, where's all that money coming from? It's coming from you, and it's going to private people who get those contracts. And a big motivation for a lot of the wars that we're in is just that. All the people who are going to benefit lobby the hardest. And then when you start to see this legislator, this congresswoman or congressman is actually married to the CEO of this defense contractor. You follow me? So start looking at everything through that lens, and it makes a lot more sense. The political means, the Iran war is the political means for sucking of an even vaster amount of money, even though, again, you'll look at this and you'll say, well, the military is $1 trillion a year. And, even the big wars we fought, like Afghanistan and Iraq, were costing $100 billion or so. And the rest of it's just maintaining this useless edifice called the military. Maybe we'll leave it there. I just wanted to first of all, recommend this book. It's really great. I think I said turn of the century. It might have been a little earlier than that. It's right in there. It's in the progressive era where Oppenheimer wrote this. And to me, it makes the unclear clear. What's really going on here? Why do they only want electric cars? Because they're way more expensive, higher margins, no competition from cheaper functional alternatives. Why do they do cash for clunkers? Get rid of cheaper alternatives. It was an investment in making you pay more. And everything the government does makes prices higher. And of course, that includes the Federal Reserve. And maybe we'll do an episode about the Federal Reserve as the political means, because the central banks throughout history have always been the same thing. And that's why the same people have always told you, you're not safe without them. It's a scam. You're the victim. and stop listening to these politicians talk about, principles and philosophical reasoning for the positions they take, or public good, or being fair, or keeping us safe, and start thinking in terms of the political means, and you'll know what to do. Again, thanks for watching. Please do like, comment, subscribe, comment on the show notes page, or in the comments section on my YouTube channel for this episode. And if you want to get on my email list and get some more free content, at least a few times a week, go to itsthefedstupid.com, my book about the Federal Reserve, and it'll have you sign up on my email list and you'll get a free copy of that book. So once again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.